Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
In the hours that followed the U.S.-Israel strikes on Iran, Canada was one of the first to come out the gate and throw its support behind our southern ally. But in the days that followed, Prime Minister Mark Carney's response loosened its grip from its unwavering tone, instead becoming regretful with almost a hint of, what I say should check every box. For example, his comments in Australia when asked whether or not Canada would have a presence in the region.
One can never categorically rule out participation. We will stand by our allies when it makes sense. There's a distinction between the offensive actions that were taken and are being taken by the United States and Israel, that were taken by them without consultation with Canada, with other allies, and we're not party to those actions. But we will always defend Canadians. We will always stand by and defend our allies when called upon.
So the question is, where does Canada stand, both ideologically and physically, in the war in Iran? And what kind of diplomatic balancing act does Carney need to continue to help Canadians stay on the right side of this fight, wherever that may be? I'm Maria Kestane, and today on The Big Story, I'm speaking to Alexander Salt, a post-doctoral fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, to get into how Canada fits into both the broader picture and on-the-ground involvement in the conflict in the Middle East. Alexander, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You know, we're seeing Mark Carney go through all the motions of this war live and in real time. He was first relatively steadfast in throwing his support behind the U.S. and Israel, then changing the tone a bit, throwing that word regret in there. And there seems to be a bit of confusion as to how he's trying to respond and react. From what you can tell, how is the government trying to position itself?
Certainly. So I think the number one strategic focus for Canada in this issue is managing its relationship with Trump and the Trump administration, because Canada has a wide number of issues that are currently ongoing with the administration. First and foremost, the ongoing trade negotiations with the USMCA that we are trying to get wrapped up by the summer. And of course, there's a number of broader issues that are also ongoing alongside that. You know, we're in the process of renewing or modernizing NORAD in terms of continental defense here in North America. And obviously, President Trump has been fairly temperamental, very reactionary. We can see that by his public statements and perhaps more forcefully through his Truth Social postings on his social media app. And so my initial reading of how Prime Minister Carney and the Canadian government has been framing their responses has been doing so in a way that does not irritate President Trump and create wider problems for matters for Canada where they have more of a strategic interest, which again is managing that relationship with the United States and the economic relationship as well. The Carney government likely does not want to waste political capital debating or getting into a dispute with the Trump administration on an issue like Iran, for example.
I mean, what did you make of his initial statement, though, Prime Minister Carney's initial statement? What did you make of it?
So it wasn't terribly surprising. I mean, if you look across the primary U.S. allies in Western Europe, like the NATO states, to even Japan and South Korea in the Indo-Pacific, Prime Minister Carney's comments, I think, are generally speaking in line with how most U.S. allies have been responding to this ongoing issue, which is sort of muted, almost like, not trying to rock the boat, making a statement that will not be picked up by the administration as something to focus. The Trump administration is something to focus on. So I would say my initial reaction essentially is it was what I expected, and if you look around internationally, it's more or less what a large number of U.S. allies have done.
Do you think in any way, personally speaking, do you think Carney rushed to be one of the first allies to respond to the strike? I mean, you kind of said it yourself. It was more about political capital rather than potentially supporting the actual strikes themselves. I mean, we know Carney and his art of diplomacy. He is one of the best speakers, and he really knows how to play on words and use tone and his presentation to shape a narrative or shape a speech the way he wants to without rocking the boat. But again, in this particular situation, it almost looks like he kind of wants to have his cake and eat it too, if we do consider the context of the Davos speech, you know?
So I think to get a little wider with this, I think there's been a sort of a misinterpretation of the Davos speech in particular with relation to this, because I think some folks interpreted that speech as specifically an anti-Trump, almost anti-American stance, and my takeaway from that is more of it wasn't so much U.S. focus, but more so, Canada just needs to be a bit more realistic about its foreign policy. Historically, we have been prone to sort of lofty rhetoric, if you will. We've been more ideal, taking more idealized stances on issues, promoting very much liberal internationalist rhetoric, which is fair. But in the contemporary context, where there's a lot more at stake in terms of actual outcomes for Canada, like I said, the ongoing relationship with the United States is at a very rocky point that we could potentially have a disrupted trade relationship if things go too south, which is an existential threat to Canada, right? Literally, 70%, I think, of our trade is, or a high number of our trade is tied to the U.S. market in terms of exports and our imports. That we have to just be quite frank and pragmatic at how we approach international affairs. If we just look at how the Americans have evolved quite rapidly in the last 20 years, where President Trump is throwing away the historical legacy of many of America's alliances, right? Throwing away the importance that countries have that have built relationships with the United States since the Second World War. I'm talking about decades-long relationship building, and all of a sudden, the Trump administration is, well, what have you done for me lately? We have to be very, aware of that change, and we have to be just pragmatic about, okay, well, we can't rely on history to get our backs. We can't rely on our longstanding friendship with the Americans and our integration with the Americans. We have to continue to demonstrate value to them if we want to maintain the relationship, which Canada, quite frankly, does. And that means that on issues like this, the war in Iran, that we will not be confrontational with the Trump administration.
Ottawa has said it isn't closing the door on potentially sending Canadian military into the region. What could Canadian involvement in Iran or in the region widely look like?
So the Canadian military's ability to participate in the region is fairly limited. Right? We don't have a large military. We certainly do not have significant forces deployed to the region. We do have some personnel. The government, as far as I'm able to tell, has not directly said how many, but the immediate participation that could occur would be basically staff officers. So these are officers who are stationed with the United States or with partner regions in the region. So Qatar, for example, I believe there's some Canadian personnel and some other neighboring states there. And what staff officers do are basically help command and control. They assist with planning, coordinating, and administrative tasks. So basically the oversight of forces. So sending basically officers like that to assist in coordination and planning is something that absolutely could happen. And we certainly have personnel in the region to do that. I would be very, very surprised if, for example, the Royal Canadian Air Force were to participate in any sort of ongoing operation. Not only would it be, I suspect, be reluctant to go that far in terms of supporting the Americans, that might be a step too far, but also from the American perspective, military operations like this, they tend to not want to involve too many allies unless they absolutely need to. The Americans are kind of highly controlling about many of these operations, and so they don't want to give further say in terms of strategy, target selection to another power. So they're working basically just with the Israelis in their current operations, and I would be very, very surprised if they wanted to bring in any other power any other state into that mix. if you look at the Australians, the French, the British, they're not participating in terms of joining airstrikes as well. So that's a clear signal. Like if those partners aren't participating, then we wouldn't as well. There's also the potential for the Royal Canadian Navy to send a ship or two into the region. But again, if we looked at recent events, so for example, the Red Sea crisis that happened last year and the year prior with the Houthis in Yemen and the strikes on international shipping in the Red Sea, well, the Royal Canadian Navy's participation on that was fairly limited as well. We were mostly sending staff officers to assist in like the coordination efforts there. So essentially, the way that we would likely participate would be some personnel might participate, and they might not even be with the Americans. It might be more so helping Gulf states and other partners in the Middle East focus on air defense or protecting their airspace.
Yeah, on Friday, the Canadian Armed Forces said it will be meeting with allied military to come up with a plan and present it to Ottawa. So I guess we'll have to see what unfolds there. But I'm curious to know what kind of a wake-up call this serves for Canada's state of defense. We know, as you said, we are not equipped like the Americans are. Our defense and our military isn't at that level. Where do we go from here in terms of investing in our defense for, I guess, the realities of Trump's second term?
That's an excellent question. So I think there's two focuses there. Firstly is I think it's a clear signal that one, we need to keep our focus on this defense investment, right? This is something that, in terms of not only like maintaining our relationship with the United States, but also like giving Canada more freedom of action. That if we wanted to do something without the Americans, that we need to invest in the military. We need to enhance our capabilities. In terms of what potential lessons learned could be drawn from the opening days of this current war, this current conflict. Well, a lot of hostile munitions are flying through the air. So a lot of missiles, a lot of drones. That means a clear investment focus and priority for the Canadian military is air defense, right? In terms of, we have 4 deployed forces in Latvia right now, right? As part of the NATO, our commitment to NATO. A big focus there is going to be anti-drone capabilities, knocking these things out of the sky, detecting, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, or ISR, as it's known in the military world, being able to identify hostile incoming targets. It's going to be a big investment. That also extends to continental security as well. So we're in the process of modernizing NORAD, North American Air Defense Command. That just, I think, to me, shows the importance of that you need to be able to identify hostile munitions coming in from the skies, hostile incursions. You need to know what's going on in your own airspace. So certainly radar and sensor investments are going to, I think, receive a significant focus. And of course, one of the bigger questions that the Canadian military is dealing with in terms of potential future investments is the next generation of fighter jets for the Royal Canadian Air Force. There's of course the two basically main competitors. There's the Saab, a Swedish manufactured Gripen, and the U.S. manufactured F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. So that's going to be a major consideration. But certainly, I think you can make the case that the Royal Canadian Air Force, regardless of which aircraft they select, needs more aircraft.
U.S. House Speaker Mike Johnson had this to say on Thursday.
We are not at war. We have no intention of being at war. The President and the Department of Defense have made this very clear. The Department of War has made it very clear. This is a limited operation. It's an operation that's limited in its scope and duration. It has a very clear mission, and that mission is nearly accomplished.
The reality is, though, the U.S.'s stance also seems to be changing by the hour. How will their lack of preparedness or plan affect how Canada gets involved, do you think?
Nobody can predict how a war or a conflict is going to unfold. And I've been using that term specifically, war, because it is a war. It's the organized use of armed force for some sort of political objective. Calling it a euphemism or a synonym, it's pointless in my eyes. This is a war. Let's just make no qualms about it. And the history of armed conflict in the 20th century, and the 21st century, and deeper into the past has shown that states assume that military operations are going to be much shorter than they are all the time. I can guarantee you in Moscow, in the lead up to February 2022, when they began their war of aggression in Ukraine, they did not expect to still be fighting that war in 2026, but here we are. So I am very skeptical that depending on how the Americans want the outcome to be, and they haven't clearly articulated that, they've floated a few things, they've suggested regime change, right? But it is very difficult to lead to regime change if you're just relying on airstrikes. And seemingly, I'm skeptical that President Trump would authorize a ground invasion. He's somewhat risk averse. We can even looking back to the first term or his first administration that he seems to likes to engage in bombing campaigns, but once they don't end quickly, he becomes very hesitant to justify the continuation. So, for example, in the previous year, when the Americans and the Israelis bombed Iran earlier, that ended, and that ended because President Trump did not want to continue the operation, right? So what you might see is that President Trump might grow bored of the conflict, might want to end it, and then what you'll get is, well, I guess what you could call a tactical success for the Americans, in which a bunch of the Iranian military capabilities are destroyed. Certainly, their political leadership has been decimated, and several of their nuclear facilities have also been destroyed. But the Iranian government might still be in place and be more emboldened and quite frankly, angrier moving forward. The longer this conflict goes, however, if that shortened, if the war doesn't end soon, if they decide we're in this for the long haul, that, in my eyes, would potentially increase the probability or the risk that Canadian military would be involved to some degree.
Trump, as of Friday, said that unconditional surrendering from the regime is the only way that he could mark this as a victory. I mean, how likely is that? And I guess, to your point of, the length of this war, will hinge on whether or not Canada gets involved. I mean, do we see this regime unconditionally surrendering?
No. What's very clear is that internally in Iran, that while there is certainly opposition to the current government internally, there's not a waiting in power government domestically that could take over right away. If the current government were to collapse, one of two outcomes is likely to happen in my eyes. Firstly, you might see a new military dictatorship occur in Iran, where basically a faction or factions within their security services decide, hey, things would be better if I was running things. And so there would be a coup. The fact that the United States has been essentially targeting their most senior leaders in so-called decapitation strikes potentially creates the opportunity for something like that to unfold. If that doesn't happen, you might see a populist style, uprising in which it is a complete unknown what would happen, other than there would almost certainly be a fair amount of domestic chaos and potentially civil war. So I do not see any sort of positive outcome in terms of the short term, at least, if the Iranian government collapses. And certainly with I think a fairly clear reluctance from the United States and the Israelis to sending ground forces, they're not going to be able to shape what happens, right? History has sort of shown that when it comes to airstrikes, you can destroy a significant amount of a country's infrastructure, you can destroy their military capacity, but airstrikes aren't boots on the ground. They can't necessarily force change to occur. You can only create potential conditions for change to occur by internal factors. So basically, that if the government collapses, it's just a complete unknown what would happen. It would and likely not a positive outcome.
This war is obviously causing quite the mess across the region. Attacks in Lebanon, strikes in Cyprus and Saudi, and even Turkey saying they took down a missile fired in their direction. Turkey is a NATO country. So how wide or big could this war spread?
Yeah, certainly. So Turkey being a NATO member, if missiles and drone strikes from either the Iranians themselves or from some of their proxy allies. So something that is one of the the Iranians' more effective potential responses is they have strong strategic relationships with several groups throughout the Middle East. Hezbollah in Lebanon, various militias in Iraq, various groups in Syria, and of course the Houthis in Yemen. So these various groups they're not members of the Iranian military. They are, they have their own interests, but they do receive material support from the Iranian military and intelligence services, and do tend to align fairly close ideologically with Iranian interests. And so what we've seen in the past is Iran has pushed these proxy actors to engage in attacks against either the United States or other actors in the region. So if, for example, some of these actors were to engage in attacks against Turkey, you might see Turkey saying, hey, we need to invoke Article 5 of the NATO Charter. We need to bring in some of our help from our allies who are legally by a treaty obligation obligated to. And so Canada could potentially find themselves drawn into helping to protect Turkey specifically in that front. We also might see, if there is continued destructive attacks against, say, for example, the Saudis and other Gulf states, you might see other actors begin to get involved as well, because no country wants to see their infrastructure destroyed, their citizens killed, and then not engage in a militarized response themselves, because it potentially exposes their government to significant domestic criticism. So there is, the longer this conflict goes and the more aggressive that Iran gets in their responses, including and especially the use of the proxy allies, there is the potential for wider regional instability to continue.
We know that Ottawa is sending help to Canadians in the region. There's thousands of Canadians registered within the Middle East, and they're sending flights or buses, and they're chartering travel to get Canadians out. We know that Ottawa is helping. How do we see, or how can we predict the next few days or even weeks unfolding as it pertains to Canada's involvement, both on the ground as people in the countries and, potential military action?
Yeah, so certainly I think Global Affairs Canada is going to be is going to accelerate their efforts in terms of preparing for the potential evacuation of likely several thousand dual national citizens in the region, and certainly those Canadian citizens who just might be on visiting, tourism, etc. So you will likely see the chartering of what they've done in the past is they charter flights to send in large numbers to regional airports where and as well as sending extra Global Affairs Canada staff to basically facilitate the evacuation of Canadian citizens from the region. They've done that at several points in the recent past during armed conflict in the Middle East. And you likely see the Canadian military is likely, since the start of this conflict, has been running through a number of potential scenarios of response. They are almost certainly in close coordination with the U.S. in terms of learning what they can, because we do have a very good working relationship with the United States, and you'll likely see Canadian military units, at least not actively deployed, but basically preparing for deployment if things continue to get worse.
All right, Alexandra, I'm going to leave it on that note. Thank you so much for your insights on this. Appreciate that.
No, thank you so much for having me.
And that was The Big Story. We'd love to hear your feedback on this conversation. Send us an email at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or find us on Blue Sky @thebigstory. If you know someone that might find this episode interesting, feel free to send it to them. New episodes publish every morning, Monday through Friday, and don't miss our weekend listens. I'm Maria Kestane. Thanks for listening.